That's enough out of you. A weekly podcast where you'll hear the truth, or at least a closer version of the truth than most of the bullshit that's out there. Here are your hosts, Bill Rader and Sean Kane.
Welcome to That's Enough Out of You. I'm your host, Bill Rader.
And I'm Sean Kane.
And this is a podcast where we talk about almost everything. Sports, we talk about history, we talk about sports history, a lot of the important historical figures and events. We also talk about organized crime, like we're going to talk about today. We talk about pop culture stuff too, like TV shows, movies, music, things like that.
We talk about whatever we want because it's our show, Billy.
That's right. It is our show. So how you doing, Sean? How's it going?
Good, buddy. How are you doing tonight?
Not too bad. I'm back from a weekend away. I spent a weekend with some friends, went to see an NFL football game, which I haven't done in quite a while. So,
how'd that go, buddy?
Nice. It was a fun weekend. It was good.
And who'd you go see? The Jets?
Yeah, well, the Jets were in Pittsburgh, so I'm not a Jets fan. I'm not a Steelers fan, but my friend of mine has season tickets to the Steelers, so he said, "You want to go to a game?" I said, "Yeah." So I picked the Jets, but
well, Billy, I don't want to insult anybody, buddy, but if the Jets were playing in my backyard, I don't think I'd watch the game.
Yeah, I agree. Although they did win the game, they came back and won the game yesterday, but
which doesn't say too much for the Steelers, I guess.
No, the Steelers are having a rough year. But it was fun. We had a good time. We spent the night in Pittsburgh on Saturday night. Ate at a really, really nice restaurant and just had a good time. We had fun.
That's good, buddy. Good to hear it.
Yeah. So anyway, other than that, the usual stuff going on. I did have a funny story I wanted to tell you. Something happened a couple of weeks ago. We have good friends who actually they invited us to their wedding next year. It's a destination wedding in the Dominican, and we're hoping we're able to go to that. They're good enough friends to to invite us to their wedding, but something happened that so all right, so I'll get to the story. So our kids are pretty good friends. My son Jeremy, who's 9, is friends with her son, and then he also has a daughter who's around Jeremy's age. So we spend a fair amount of time together. And one night, Mary Alice and I went out to my wife and I. Mary Alice went out to dinner, and we got home and she said, "Oh, I forgot. I have some stuff that I need to take over to our friend's house. They're going to take this stuff to homeless shelter with some food and a case of water, stuff like that." So she asked me if I'd take it over. So I said, yeah. So I loaded it in the back of my car, drove it over there, and it was evening, a little dark out, and as we record this, we're in Halloween season. So they had some Halloween decorations out as I noticed when I pulled up to the front of their house. And I then noticed something else in the front window, very front window of their house. I saw what appeared to be a naked rear end. And I thought, that's a very odd Halloween decoration. So started walking around to the back of my car to get the stuff, and I turned back around and it was moving. And at that point I realized this is not a decoration, that this is an actual naked human being with their rear end hanging out the window pretty much for all the world to see.
Oh, boy.
So I was wondering what was going on. I gathered all the stuff from the back of my car and started walking towards the house, and realized that it was this man that's my friend. And I thought to myself, a number of things went through my head.
I could only imagine what you were thinking.
But I'm just thinking to myself, like, what is he doing? Like, we're friends, but we're not that close. So I continue walking towards the house, expecting, something to happen, to change, or I didn't know what was going on. And I get up to where he is in the window, and I just pretended not to notice. I just walked right past it. Got to the front door and rang the doorbell, and I hear a lot of commotion. And he comes running over to the front door, opens the door. Now, fortunately, at this point, he at least put on boxer shorts. And he said, "Oh my God, did you just see my butt?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I uh, was didn't really want to, but I did." And he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I was trying to prank my fiance and the kids. They hate it when I moon them." He said, "I'm so sorry. I did not mean. I thought you were them. I didn't know. I couldn't
Oh
see
man.
because it's dark. I couldn't. It looked like their car pulling up." So I was like, yeah, that's okay. Here, take the stuff, and I'm gonna go now." And I was really weirded out, but I got back in the car and started driving away. And at some point, it just hit me how funny it was, and I started laughing so hard I nearly drove off the road. And I called my wife to tell her what had happened, and she said he's already on the phone with me apologizing. Oh yeah, it was
Oh boy, that's a good
it,
one, Billy.
yeah, it was an interesting night, that's for sure. And then of course I had to post on Facebook that there was a full moon that night, and tagged him and his fiance in that post. And we had a good time. We went back and forth with it. And then somebody who had no idea what was going on, a mutual friend, posted something like, it was a clear night, so he posted something like, you can see all the way to Jupiter. And I said, yeah, well, I already saw Uranus.
Oh man. On
Yeah.
that note,
On that note, so today's episode is really interesting. We're gonna Sean is gonna spend a little bit of time on Cosa Nostra, not the typical Cosa Nostra that we see a lot of, in movies, but the sort of related Cosa Nostra. We're talking about the Irish mob and the Jewish mob that we don't hear as much about as we do the Italian mafia. So, Sean, you want to? I don't know where you want to start, but
well, I've been studying, and reading about organized crime for over 25 years. And the thing is, I've at times I've been accused of like glorifying the gangsters, which I never do. I mean, it's kind of like, Quint glorifies the shark in Jaws. You know what I mean? Like, I'm
right,
not confused by these people. I know exactly who they are. They're criminals, but you got to admit they're fascinating. They're a fascinating read, and there's interesting stories there. And one of the things that interests me always was the dynamic between the Irish gangster, the Jewish gangster, and the Italian mafia, which is called Cosa Nostra. And Cosa Nostra represents the 26 families, Italian families throughout the U.S. And that dynamic between how the Irish gangster and the Jewish gangster worked with the Italians, and at times um, went to war with the Italians. So that dynamic always interests me. So I guess we just start at the beginning, Bill. Um,
yeah. I mean, a lot of the roots of organized crime in this country started with Jews and Irish and
it
Italian. I
did.
mean, everybody.
Well, I think there's a lot of confusion, Bill. If anybody's seen the gangs in New York, which Scorsese did a great job with, you seen there that organized crime in the United States actually did start with the Irish, and then what happened is the Irish immigrant, they moved into unions and police departments, and they just kind of moved onward in society. And then when the Italians came over, they kind of took over organized crime. But the Irish gangster was still there. The Jewish gangster was up and coming, and that's where the whole thing started. But I think the first Cosa Nostra family was actually in New Orleans in the late 1800s, which later Carlos Marcello, which was a powerful mob boss in the South, he would later run that family. But really, the beginning, the roots of organized crime, I think when it all, the birth, I should say, would be Atlantic City in the conference in the 20s, like 1929, 1930, somewhere around there, when Nookie Johnson, who was Irish, and he ran Atlantic City, and they had a conference with Al Capone and gangsters from Chicago, and of course the three main gangsters who I think started the organized crime in this country would be Oni Madden, who was Irish from New York, Meyer Lansky, who was Jewish, and Lucky Luciano, who was Sicilian, and they started they organized what would become the syndicate. And I think that meeting is when they kind of start dividing up the territory and starting to, try to tone down some of the violence. And like I said earlier, like the Irish gangster, the Jewish gangster worked with the Italian gangster, but when they went to war, I mean, there was some violent. Like if you look at, of course, there's no place like Chicago in the 20s when Al Capone and
Yeah.
Bugs Moran went to war. I mean, that was a vicious, absolutely vicious war, Bill. And the thing is, like, this is why I get kind of upset when people try to throw old man Kennedy in there like he was a bootlegger, like those two guys. I mean, those two guys were ruthless. I mean, absolutely ruthless. I mean, let's face it. Old man Kennedy was 25 years old. He's a bank president, Bill. I mean, I know guys that are 50 that can't balance a checkbook. This guy was a
Right.
bank president. But but the bootleggers like Moran was as vicious as could be, and he was taking it to Capone for a while, and then of course it ends up with the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and that was basically the end of the Moran gang. But Capone never actually got Moran in that attack.
Sean, talk a little bit about what they were doing. Like what was, so, we hear, obviously we hear a lot about organized crime. We know that there were, especially during Prohibition, there was a lot with, um, you know, obviously booze and things like that. But what were the things that they were doing, at that time that were so, that were against the law, things that were making them so much money, the reason for all of this violence and all of the
Well,
attention.
Prohibition bill was one of the dumbest laws ever. I mean,
Yeah.
that was I don't know what the government was thinking there, and it created the bootlegger, and the money that they were making by illegally distributing beer was just unbelievable. I mean, there was so much money at stake at a time when the country was in a depression. So there was just so much money, and then later on, they would evolve into taking over the unions and shaking down the unions, and loan sharking or shylocking would be a big thing,
So
and
a
of
lot
course
of these
illegal
terms,
gambling.
a
Go
lot of
ahead,
these
Bill.
terms that you're talking about, loan sharking, Shylock, probably a lot of our listeners have heard them, but may not really understand what they mean. Could you just kind of explain some of those things?
Well, yeah, loan shark basically, where somebody can't goes to a bank and gets a loan and he gets turned down, he has to go to the street for that loan. So you would go to a loan shark, and the problem with doing that is they would give you the money no problem, no matter what you wanted, but you're going to pay an extremely high interest on that loan, and if you can't pay it back, I mean, they don't care. I mean, that's the thing. Like, they don't want to hear any stories about, you had this happen, your car broke down, or whatever. Probably going to get your kneecaps taken out with a baseball bat.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way they deal with it. But loan sharking was really big. Illegal gambling was big. You know, that was another huge thing.
Hmm.
So there was just so much money. But the unions, I think, was one of the biggest. Like when you start taking over the unions, and start with like you look at the pension fund with Teamsters with Jimmy Hoffa. I mean that's just there's so much money there. Multi-million dollar pension fund, and they're stealing it blind. So I think
Yeah, they're
that was huge.
siphoning money from the pension fund, and really nothing that anybody could do about it because they were in bed together. I mean,
No,
the mobsters, these guys would get, they would get, essentially they'd get contracts, they'd get jobs,
well
for,
they'd have no show jobs.
right.
and they would take over the union. They would have an official that was corrupt, and it was like an interesting story. Is like Nicky Scarfo, who ran the Philadelphia Cosa Nostra, when he was talking about Atlantic City and taking and they had a mayor take over, and he started slamming organized crime and saying that we're going to keep those jackals out of here. I forget the exact term he used, and we're going to make sure that they don't have nowhere to. They're not going to be nowhere near the casinos and this and that. And Nicky Scarfo looked at one of his lieutenants and he said, "Doesn't this guy realize we're already here?" And that's the thing. They were already in the. You know what I mean? They already had officials in the hotel and restaurant workers union.
Right.
So that's how they get in. And then even with the concrete construction and cement, they're built when the buildings are first being built. The mob already had control of that.
And just to be clear, when getting back to the unions for a second, the pension funds, I mean, they're stealing money from hardworking people. They were stealing, and some of it may continue to this day. I don't know, but these are the things that do sometimes get glorified in the movies. I know, with The Godfather, you remember the line that Tom Hagen had, when he said, "Well, we already have the unions and this, we already have this," and yeah, that means that they're stealing money from people who are working hard, trying to feed their families, and this is how they're making, this is how they're making their money, by stealing money from hardworking people. Just to kind of emphasize, these are not folk heroes. They're not people to be to be celebrated. These are criminals.
It's not Robin Hood. I mean, they're not Robin Hood.
Absolutely not.
I mean, like you said, they're taken from the working man. But they do make fascinating stories, though, Bill. And
absolutely.
I mean, some of the things, like when you talk about, another war that went on was Danny Green in Cleveland was an Irish gangster who went to war with the Cleveland mafia, the Italian mafia. And there was like a period of almost a year, Bill, where there was 36 car bombs that went off. And Danny Green's gang actually ended up killing the underboss of the Cleveland family. And Cleveland had to go to New York. They had to go to the 5 families in New York to bring in more people to help them. And they eventually took out Danny Green. But that was a war that went on that, and there's a great movie on that, To Kill the Irishman.
That was a great movie.
And the book is really good, too.
Yeah.
Same title. And you see that, but when the Irish gangster, when you get an Irish gangster and an Italian gangster working together, that's pretty scary. Or a Jewish gangster and an Italian gangster working together, they could really do some damage. Like when you look at like Russell Buffalino and Frankie the Irishman Sheeran, or up in Boston you had Whitey Bulger, who ran the Irish gang, the Winter Hill Gang, but his right hand was Stephen the Rifleman Flemmy, who was actually Italian. And when you get them working together, and I think there's no more violent duo, I think, in the history of organized crime, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, or if you agree with me on this, than the Westies, Jimmy Coonan, and Roy DeMeo from the Gambino family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've read everything you could read about organized crime, and those two guys were brutal. I mean, I don't think there's 2 gangsters that were more brutal than them two.
Yeah, I mean, these are guys that literally the Gambinos had to corral them,
but they never did, Bill.
Right?
They tried to, but they never could control them two. They never, in the Westies. I mean, the Westies and the DeMeo crew, they both had a thing they called doing the Houdini, which was, they had this whole thing where they would kill somebody and they would chop them up in pieces. The body would never be found. And they were responsible for so many disappearances. I mean, police couldn't even really put a number on it. Law enforcement I've heard so many different figures. I don't even want to speculate how many people those 2 groups killed. But, I mean, they're just as vicious as you could be.
And everybody always says, well, the mafia, they only kill each other. They're still killing. They're still killing people. They're still chopping up human beings and sending body parts to their spouses. And I mean,
Bill, if you read the stories about the Westies, they were like Jimmy Coonan, literally cut the head off of a guy by the name of Patty Dugan, and he was carrying the head around the bars in the west side of Manhattan, which is known as Hell's Kitchen, which they controlled. I mean, He was these guys were as vicious as could be, and sometimes innocent people do get killed. There was a story with Roy DeMeo where he got into a beef with a Cuban drug lord down in Miami, and he was paranoid that the Cuban drug lord would put a hit on him, and he ended up killing a guy because he thought he was a Cuban hitman, and he was actually just an innocent salesman, door-to-door salesman. And Roy DeMeo killed him and chopped him up, and the body was never found.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, just the viciousness of those two guys. I mean, it's amazing. And the Westies, the entire crew, I should say the crew of the Westies and the crew, the Mayo crew, they were just absolutely vicious. And the Gambino family couldn't control them.
Yeah, I mean, could you imagine that? These are, you know, a group of criminals telling another group of criminals, you guys are way too. I mean, group of violent criminals telling another group of violent criminals, you guys are way too violent. You need to tone it down.
Castellano called them a bunch of cowboys. Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family, and when he initially, what happened was there was a loan shark, a Jewish loan shark in Manhattan he's servicing all 5 families, Ruby Stein. And what happened was Coonan, with the blessing, it looks like the blessing of Roy DeMeo through one of his guys, they ended up killing Ruby Stein. But before they did, they borrowed all his money. He was a loan shark, and they borrowed, $50,000, $25,000, $100,000. Everybody's borrowing from, he was leaving. Everybody knew it but him. And they invited him into a bar, and they shot him, and they killed him. And what happened was that was enough for Castellano. He's like, he knew who did it, but he didn't want to go to war with those guys. So what he did is he called a meeting, and he had Roy DeMeo bring Jimmy Coonan and his second-in-command, Mickey Featherstone, and they met at an Italian restaurant in New York. And Castellano brought other members of the 5 families that were there. And Coonan thought they were going to kill him. So he had his guys set up across the street, and they had machine guns, they had heavy firepower, and he said, if we're not out in an hour, come in guns blazing. They had grenades and everything, Bill. They were going to blow that whole block up. But what happened was Castellano made a deal with them, and the other thing is Castellano, DeMeo was telling him, look, I could control these guys, and the funny thing is DeMeo's going to control the Westies, and nobody could control DeMeo, so Castellano made the deal, and, with the Westies, and he thought he had them in line, and he never did. He never had them under control. And then eventually John Gotti would end up taking over, and he would grow a liking to the Westies. He would never even try to control them because he liked them out of control.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
did they use the Westies as as contract killers? I mean,
yeah. I mean, that's the thing that the Westies were great at. They were great at killing people. I mean, and the thing is, the Westies took over from, eventually, the name I mentioned earlier, Oni Madden, he ran Hell's Kitchen for years. And then eventually he would pass it on, and it would eventually end up in the hands of Mickey Spillane, who was the boss. And what happened was Mickey Spillane had an issue with the Italian mafia because the Javits Convention Center was being built in the 70s, and it was in Mickey Spillane's territory. Now, the relationship between Spillane and the 5 families was always, sticking our territories, but major projects like that, like you would cut the other side in, and Spillane didn't want to cut the Italians in at all. So the Genovese family, which was the acting boss was Fat Tony Salerno, he hired an Irish hitman by the name of Mad Dog Sullivan to start taking out Spillane's guys. And at the same time, Spillane had an issue with some of the younger guys in Hell's Kitchen. One of them was Jimmy Coonan, who would later take over the Westies, because he shook down Spillane shook down Jimmy Coonan's father, and made him pay protection money. Coonan's father was just an accountant. He wasn't a gangster, but he was doing business in Hell's Kitchen, so he had to pay protection money. And the protection racket was another big racket of organized crime.
Right.
Basically they would go to legitimate businesses and say, listen, you're going to pay this kind of tax, so nothing happens to your business, and we're going to protect it. And they're basically paying protection so they don't harm the business. You know what I'm
Right.
saying?
Right. Something that the police get paid to do.
Right. And then Spillane was he had a tricky relationship with Italians because he was actually kidnapping Italian gangsters, holding them for ransom. And a lot of times the Italians would just pay it off. They would just pay it because they were making so much money. They really didn't, they really didn't concern about it till one guy got killed. And then when one of the gangsters got killed, then all of a sudden they said enough is enough. And with the thing with the Javits Center, they put out a hit. And then Spillane had the Westies coming after him too. And that's where the friendship with Roy DeMeo and Jimmy Coonan come into play, because Roy DeMeo felt if he could get the Westies on his side and get them kind of under control, he could go back to Castellano, and he would finally be a made man. Because at the time he wasn't even made; he would eventually just become a soldier. But he was a soldier with his own crew, And Spillane would actually make a comment, that we would be safer in Belfast, meaning Belfast, Northern Ireland, because we would actually know who the enemy is there, because he was getting hit from all sides.
Yeah.
And eventually what happened was Roy DeMeo took Spillane out. He shot him. And he shot him right on the street. And then, Coonan takes over the Westies, and the rest is history. The violence is just unbelievable.
Now, what about, is there still these things still going on today? And I know, obviously during the 90s, a lot of the New York mob was, I don't want to say cleaned up, but there was a lot done to put a lot of these guys in prison, and a lot of things went into effect to, the RICO laws were in effect to take a lot of these guys out. How are there still remnants today that we still see?
I think, Bill, you're always going to see organized crime in places like New York, Philly, Boston, Chicago. But what was the syndicate, Cosa Nostra, it'll never be what it used to be. They'll never have the power that they once had. The times are just changing too much. There's just the government actually they run gambling now.
Right.
And as far as the unions, I'm sure they still have some local control, but it's not like it was, and I don't think it ever will be.
Yeah.
And there's just too many guys that ended up that became boss that really shouldn't have been boss. And it wasn't run like it was run in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But that's what I always interested me, Bill. Like you take like a Jimmy Burke, who was made famous in Goodfellas.
Right.
He was an Irish gangster, but he actually had a tremendous power inside the Lucchese family, which was one of the 5 Cosa Nostra families. He was almost like the acting underboss, even though he wasn't a made guy because he wasn't Italian. So that relationship, and then when you take, like a Mickey Cohen was a tremendous power, and Meyer Lansky, they were powerful Jewish gangsters. And I think Mickey Cohen is one too that he doesn't get a lot of power. He doesn't get a lot of publicity on the East Coast. And the West Coast, everybody knows who Mickey Cohen is. But he was a powerful gangster, Bill. I don't know how much you know about him.
Not a ton. I only kind of know, the way he was portrayed in Ray Donovan. Yeah, I really don't know much about him.
Well, the interesting thing is he was actually trained by Oni Madden, who we talked about before, in New York, and he was a young man, he was a boxer, and he was a street guy. He was real tough with his fists, so he got the attention of Madden. And then if you look at the gangsters that mentored Cohen along the way, it's a who's who of organized crime. Then he goes on to Ohio, in Cleveland, and he's mentored by Mo Dalitz, who was a Jewish gangster, and then he goes on to Chicago, where he's mentored by Murray Humphreys, who was an Irish Welsh gangster who was very high, very powerful in the outfit in Chicago, even though he wasn't Italian. He actually was an acting consigliere of that family. And then he starts to move west, and he gets farther west, I should say, and he's trained by Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, two of the most infamous Jewish gangsters of all time. So Cohen, would eventually end up running Los Angeles. And even though there was a Los Angeles Cosa Nostra family there, but they always called it the Mickey Mouse Mafia. Like, they didn't get a lot of respect, and Cohen was actually the guy that ran that city. You know.
So
But
when you
go
say
ahead.
he ran it, what did he do? I mean, was
Well,
he involved with Hollywood?
he was heavily involved with Hollywood. He was a Hollywood gangster. He was heavily involved with the unions. He ran gambling. He ran loan sharking. I mean, everything in that city went through Mickey Cohen.
So
I mean, he was a force.
When I say, I think I misspoke before. I said he was Ray Don. I meant The Offer. Actually, he was
right in The Offer.
He was portrayed in The Offer, which is a series that we're going to talk about on the making of The Godfather. We'll
talk about that. Yeah, because he actually was in jail during that period where he's in that series. So we'll talk about that at a later time. But yeah, he was a powerhouse, and it was kind of interesting because he reminds me, he's like the West Coast version of Whitey Bulger, because at times he worked with the Cosa Nostra system, but then he worked outside the Cosa Nostra system, which he was able to get away with because he was so powerful, because he was so violent. Like, there's two ways to get respect in that life, Bill. You either are a vicious killer or you're a tremendous earner. The guys that are both, like Mickey Cohen and Whitey Bulger, they get a tremendous respect. So I think we should close the show out talking about Whitey Bulger, because I don't think you could have a show on organized crime without talking about him.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Whitey, I mean, one of the most infamous gangsters of this, probably the three most infamous gangsters in history, I would say, is Al Capone, John Gotti, and Whitey Bulger. Would you agree with that, Bill?
I think so. Yeah, hard to argue with that. Yeah.
But I mean, he ran Boston. I mean, the stories I'd heard on the streets when I go up there all the time. I mean, it's unbelievable how much control he had. Like, when you talk about everything in that town, he ran through him. I mean, loan sharking, gambling, murder for hire, everything went through Whitey. And the interesting thing is, he ended up being an informant for the FBI. They were protecting him all these years. But the interesting thing about that, Bill, is the information always seemed to be going from the FBI to Whitey. Never really seemed to be going from Whitey to the FBI, you know what I mean?
Yep.
And that's how he had total control. I mean, he had the FBI in his back pocket. Like, you take the case of he was running guns to the IRA, and there was a guy by the name of John McIntyre who ended up ratting the whole operation out, and then Irish and British authorities to stop the ship, called the Valhalla, and they confiscated all these weapons. And what happens is, an FBI agent that grew up in Whitey's neighborhood, Southie, he ended up telling Bulger that McIntyre was informing, and then you could guess what happened. McIntyre disappears, and they ended up finding his body like 20 years later in a shallow grave there. So you see where the it's never flowing really from Whitey to the FBI. And when you start reading the reports, you see a lot of gossip. You see a lot of stuff that his right hand, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmy, would say, and then Conley would attribute it to Whitey. Like, it always seemed that the information's always flowing the other way, and that was part of the corruption and part of the problem there, where this went on for so long, where Whitey was basically untouchable.
Now, who was Connolly again? I'm sorry.
Conley was the FBI guy. He was the FBI agent that was in charge of handling Whitey Bulger as an informant. Right. And he grew up in Southie, and he was really close to Whitey, and he was actually closer to Whitey's brother, Billy, who was the state Senate president.
Yeah.
In Massachusetts. And he was a very powerful politician. And Conley, he grew up with the Bulger brothers. And there was a story where, Conley was on the playground when they were kids, and he was getting picked on by some older bullies, and Whitey came to his rescue, and protected him. And later on, when into the FBI. He was stationed all across the U.S., and he eventually made his way back to Boston. And when he did, he reached out to Whitey, and they formed a relationship. And that's where Whitey got his power. I mean, he was basically untouchable because the FBI was protecting him. And Conley would end up eventually going to prison, and he's still in prison. He's doing life.
So at some point, Whitey goes on the lam, so to speak, right? He disappears.
Well, what happens is, he goes on the lam because what happens is Conley retires, and there was a new DA that came in, and he was looking around, and he's saying, where's the organized crime? He came from New York, and he comes to Boston, and he's looking around, and he's like, everybody's in jail, but yet there's organized crime everywhere. So who's running things? And then he realizes everything is going back to Whitey Bulger. So he went after Bulger, and he finally got indictments against him. But once again, Conley came to his rescue and tipped him. And Bulger went on the lam, and he was on the run for like 16, 17 years before they caught him in Malibu. And he was just like a regular retiree with his girlfriend out there in an apartment on Malibu. And eventually he was convicted, and he went to prison.
And it was a neighbor, right? It wasn't it.
It was a couple tips, but it was a neighbor, that gave a tip. But it was actually the way they got him, Bill, is they got him through. His girlfriend was always going to the dentist, and they bugged the dentist. They were tracking the girlfriend. They tracked him through the girlfriend because they did get a tip from a neighbor that moved away. I think she moved to like Sweden or something, and she called into the tip line, and they ended up bugging the dentist office, and they found out that this is definitely Whitey Bulger. So what they did is they staked out the apartment building, and they made a call to have him come down to the garage that something happened. I think they said something happened to his car or something, and he came down, and they all surrounded him and arrested him. Right. But then, he goes to prison, he's convicted, and he's in solitary for all these years, and the prison system, for whatever reason, the Bureau of Prisons moves him because they said he was a threat, which at this point he's 80-some years old. He's in a wheelchair, and they move him to a prison and they put him in general population, and they move him to a prison where his enemies were. So what ends up happening is Whitey's killed in prison, and he's massacred. I mean, three guys, they butchered him till his face was unrecognizable, is what they said, and that's how the story ended.
Yeah, well, hard to feel sorry for him. I mean, this is a guy who.
Well, no, I mean, he was one of the most ruthless gangsters of all time. I mean, like I said, it's him, Capone, and Gotti, I think, are the most infamous.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's always interesting stories with these guys, but you can't get confused by they're criminals.
Right.
And they shouldn't be glorified in any way, but Hollywood, I think, portrays them the way they portray them. A lot of times they get it so wrong.
Well, that's why we're here. Right?
I think so, buddy.
We're bringing the truth. We bring the truth every week.
We try to, pal.
Yeah. All right. Good show, Sean. Good job. So, you guys, hope you enjoyed this one. You can follow us on Facebook. You can find our show. That's Enough Out of You on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter at TEOY Podcast. And we're on YouTube and coming soon to a lot of other social platforms. So you can also email us if you want to. And the email address is that'senoughoutoyoushow@gmail.com. So send us an email. Let us know what you think. Let us know your opinions on organized crime and any of the stuff that Sean was talking about today. We'd love to hear it.
And I'm sure we'll be doing another show on organized crime, Billy, at least
Absolutely.
down the road.
Yeah, we got a lot of good stuff coming up. We're going to be doing all kinds of different topics, and we're going to start doing some more pop culture stuff and some more sports. Just a lot of great stuff getting ready that we're going to have some good guests on as well. So stay tuned to That's Enough Out of You.
All right, buddy. Have a good night.
All right, Sean, you too. Take care.
All right.